So here's the explanation behind the answers to the Chapter 9 practice quiz. So note that these questions relate to Chapter 9. On a midterm, on a final, or on another quiz, it may not be obvious that all of these questions relate to Chapter 9. But within the question, you should be able to figure that out. The reason I'm saying this is that certain words within the question should give you a little bit more information than we would expect. Such as this first question here that asks about ABC Corp as a firm producing newsprint in a perfectly competitive industry. Its output is 1,500 tons, and the marginal cost of the last ton produced is $7.10, and the average revenue per ton is $6.20. In the short run, the firm should do what? Well, you should know by now, and you should start knowing by now in this chapter, and you'll know it more in chapter 10 and 11, that we must always set marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost as our profit maximizing condition. And then in certain instances, if we don't cover variable costs, if we're losing too much money, we should shut down, and so on and so forth. But the profit maximizing condition, if we choose to produce a quantity different than zero, is where marginal revenue is equal to marginal costs. Well, in this question here, we're talking about marginal cost of the last ton produced, but we're talking about average revenue. Therefore, if this question had the idea of, they don't have it here, but if they had the idea of there is not enough information, I would argue that some people would think that is the case. Otherwise, they're kind of saying either increase or decrease output or shut down. If you just look at these two pieces of information, it might be hard to answer. What you have to remember is that, and if this was a question with many other chapters, is this piece of information here that we're dealing in a perfectly competitive industry. In a perfectly competitive industry, all firms are price takers. Therefore, we have seen that in a perfectly competitive industry, price is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to average revenue. Because of that, we're in this situation where this 620 per ton average revenue is also our marginal revenue. If we have a situation where our marginal revenue is below our marginal cost, it's that we're producing too much. Therefore, we should reduce output. That's the situation that we're in. So that's pretty much it. If we have the cost of producing this last water bottle, this last product is cheaper than the revenue we get from producing, we should produce it. But if that last product is costing us more than what we could get for it, we shouldn't produce it, so we should reduce our output. So moving on to the next question. When economists say that a firm is a price taker, and it's a word I'd used for the previous question, what we mean by that is that, let's look at the answers. The demand curve that the firm faces is perfectly inelastic. Actually, the demand curve here, and when we have this two graph diagram for perfect competition, well, the demand curve that a typical firm faces is actually flat, and flat is actually perfectly elastic. So this is a wrong answer. The firm can alter the market price as it changes its rate of production. And what we say is one of the big assumptions here is that the firm is too small of a player to alter anything in terms of market price in the economy. It cannot influence anything. At the price prevailing in the market, the firm will be willing to sell an infinite quantity. That's not the case. If we look at the typical firm graph, there is a specific quantity that they want to sell. That is not the case. The firm can alter its rate of production and sales without affecting the market price of the product. That's what we mean. If the firm decides to produce more or less, they don't have any power over the price. They're such a small player that they're a price taker, so no influence happens. The firm initially takes a price given and tries to influence it through advertising. They're such a small player. It's a homogeneous product. No differentiation allowed in this market structure. Therefore, you cannot use advertising to your advantage because you're selling something that people see as completely identical to what your competitors or what the other firms are selling. So that's not the answer either. So we have here D as being the answer. Average revenue is equal to what? Well, you should remember this way to calculate. It's essentially total revenue divided by output. So by the quantity that we produce, which would be this situation here. And naturally, we could see that P times Q divided by Q is equal to P. And that is what we mentioned in question 1 as well, that price is equal to average revenue in terms of perfectly competitive market structure. This respects to total revenue, and this change in actually though these ones don't represent anything. Consider the following statements of quantities. For price is equal to minimum SRATC, marginal revenue is equal to minimum SRATC. So that would mean that when we have that marginal revenue curve that's upward sloping, and we have this ATC curve that intersects at its lowest point and then goes back up, well, if we have a situation where the price intersects with that marginal cost and that minimum short run average total cost, we've seen in class or through videos that this is the situation that arises, that leads to a situation of an output level that has zero economic profit, because the price you receive is equal to the average cost per unit, or the average total cost. They're all equal at this situation. So it's a situation where we have firms that are maximizing the profits, but they're not making any economic profits. They're not making economic losses, so they don't want to leave the market, but they're not making profits so that other people want to enter. So this is the situation that we're trying to portray. Let's see which one of these answers applies. A perfectly competitive firm that is maximizing profits, which will lead other firms to enter this industry, is not true, because there's no economic profits being made. Even though they're maximizing profits, there's no economic profits being made. A perfectly competitive firm that is producing the optimal quantity such that other firms will exit the industry, that's not true. Perfectly competitive firm that is in short run equilibrium. Let's just look at the next question. A perfectly competitive firm when the industry is in long run equilibrium, or a perfectly competitive firm that is in long run equilibrium. So even though we saw chapter 7 and chapter 8 as being short run versus long run, here when we talk about this equilibrium where there's no firms that want to leave or enter, we're talking about long run equilibrium, and this situation where all these curves intersect. If we look at the 2-graph framework, it's not on the market graph, it's on the typical firm graph. So this would be a perfectly competitive firm, and that is in long run equilibrium, not in short run, because in the short run you might have economic profits and some businesses that want to enter. In the long run is a situation that is stable over time, where there is zero economic profits being made by the firms in place. And we're talking about a firm here because we're talking about these cost curves that are representative of that specific firm. We're not talking about the aggregate demand or supply. I mean aggregate here as like all of the demand and supply aggregated together, not the same thing as we talk about in macroeconomics for the people who've done that. But we're still not talking about the whole industry here. We're not looking at that industry graph. We're looking at the typical firm graph. All right. Last but not least, consider the following total cost schedule for a perfectly competitive firm producing ballpoint pens. Well, here the market price is 40 cents, which is equal to our marginal revenue, because we're in a perfectly competitive firm. So we need to have the situation where marginal revenue is equal to marginal costs to determine the profit maximizing level of output. And in between those 2 points where that kind of amount happens is where we're maximizing revenue. So here, if I look at my marginal cost, I'm producing 10 more units for an extra cost of $2, because my fixed cost don't change. So each of those units costs 20 cents on average. So my marginal cost is 20 cents, my marginal revenue is 40. I should produce these units. Here, an extra 10 units for $1 would mean that 10 cents per unit, less than that 40 cents marginal revenue, I produce it. Here, $3 for 10 units, so 30 cents per unit, still less, I should produce it. Here, $4 for 10 units, so 40 cents per unit. I am at marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, so it's going to be here, but let's just verify that I don't want to keep going. Well, here $10.15, so I have $5 extra for 10 units, so it would be 50 cents per unit. I don't want to produce this extra batch of units. So here I'm indifferent between producing 30 or 40 because those extra 10 units that I produce, their additional cost is exactly the same amount as the additional revenue. So typically in economics, we would assume that you would produce the 40, but in reality, 30 or 40 would lead to the same profit level. So anything between 30 and 40 would lead to the same profit level. So hopefully that's clarified the questions of Chapter 9. As I mentioned before, always make sure when we're going to aggregate all these chapters in the midterm or the final that you look at little buzzwords like here, perfectly committed to the firm, which tells you a lot about how all of this is structured. So hopefully that helps. Always be wary of the little comments. Thanks.